Nick says something kind of interesting in that moment. He says that he was within and without. And we haven't talked about it a lot, but the characters in this novel are dealing with like a sense of loss, primarily from World War One. That people who fought in World War One and even people who stayed back, there was a lot of sort of restlessness, or they weren't really sure why they were going to war. We hadn't been to war for years, really, since the other big war was the Civil War. That was 50 years ago. So you had these like people who had been alive during the Civil War that had kind of looking back at their time, and they're old enough where they're sort of romanticizing war just a little bit. And so people didn't really understand what they were getting into when they went to war. I'm not sure if anybody understands, but it was a lot different than they thought it was. It was a lot more brutal. And so when people came back from war, they just felt this like sort of sense of loss and of alienation. And you had people that was like leaving the country, expatriates that were, moving to Europe. Fitzgerald was one of them. That's the lost generation, sort of, and they just didn't know how to deal with life when they came back. And so part of like the excessive drinking and partying that we see in this novel is because they're really just trying to fill this void, of like, how do you fill this void? They feel empty. They feel disconnected from each other. They feel disconnected from the country they're living in. They just feel disconnected. And so we see that through Nick to some extent, that he feels disconnected from all of the people around him. And he can't seem to connect to any one of the characters, not even really Jordan. We've seen that he doesn't necessarily love her, and there's nothing about her that he really likes. He's just sort of with her. And so he's none of this drama is his, but he's sort of vicariously living it because he himself is feeling this sort of disconnection from everything. And so that can't be underscored. And some of the actions in this, in the novel are set off or are a direct result or consequence of the war and the way people were feeling about the war when they came back from it. And it was just the 20s was party, 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 because people were just trying to fill that sort of loss, and the way they looked at the world shifted so dramatically, and they just didn't know how to deal with it. And unfortunately, everybody kind of has their thing, and there was a lot of partying, and that was one of the results of it. Okay, so we see some of those comments every now and then from Nick that sort of remind us of that. So they decide Gatsby wants to show Daisy his house. Now that's the whole purpose of her coming over there, just because he needs to prove to Daisy that he is wealthy, that he's successful. And he says to Nick, he goes, "My house looks well, doesn't it?" He goes, "It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it." And then Nick asks, "Well, how did you get the money?" He goes, "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business." But Gatsby makes a mistake here. What mistake does Gatsby make? Remember what he said his past was. What mistake is happening here? Tell your desk mate. I hope that you found this passage specifically that took 3 years to earn the money, because how was he supposed to have earned his money again? He was supposed to have inherited it by dead ancestors. So this is a mistake, and Nick sort of catches it. There's a line of dialogue in here where Nick is like, "Oh, I thought you inherited your money." And Gatsby sort of snaps at him. He says this line as sort of snappy, defensive, and he doesn't necessarily realize that he's getting defensive. So another indication here that Gatsby is lying, but Nick, doesn't really think much of it. which is maybe why if you read past it, you didn't think much of it either. And we get into it, and we get this sort of description of what Gatsby is doing. It says, he hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in the house according to the measure of the response it drew from her well-loved eyes. He was consumed with wonder at her present. He had been full of the idea so long, now he was running down like an overwound clock. That's an interesting simile. Can you find the simile in that blue text? What is Gatsby being compared to? I hope you're seeing that he's being compared to this clock. When's the last time we saw a clock? That's why this becomes a symbol for the chapter. I really want us to think about this simile, right? So we have, Gatsby is like a clock about to break. Because think about what an overwound clock would be, right? Like when you tighten it and tighten it and tighten it, it's overwound. Tighten it all the way, like you're gonna break the springs off. Like that's where Gatsby is. He was so just tense trying to get this dream, and then he gets it. They let go. And think about what that would mean for Gatsby then. What happens to an overwound clock after it runs down? Whatever our answer is to that should maybe give you some indication as to Gatsby. That's what a good simile can do, right? Similes seem easy, but you have to compare the thing to something that can really represent it. It can't just be Gatsby was like a giraffe. They're both tall. I mean, that says nothing really about the story, but if we understand what an overwound clock is, and how when it gets so tight, it's so tense, and it's going, and then what that means for it to just go until it tires out and dies. I mean, that's a pretty decent simile happening there. So that should tell us, really, in one, in a quick, it's foreshadowing what's going to happen to Gatsby. Is he going to be able to keep this dream? So he takes her on this tour, and the weirdest thing happens. He takes her into his bedroom, into his closet, and he goes through all of his shirts. Says he took out a pile of shirts, probably is what it's supposed to say, and began throwing them. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids and coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange. We're noticing pattern 4 again here. With monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. And first we need to understand why he would throw these shirts to begin with. And some things that get lost on us 100 years later is the description. Because I can go into any store now and I can buy almost any color of anything. If you are into fashion, you know that certain colors are more expensive than other colors. You also know that certain scrolls, certain plaids, and even certain stripes are more expensive. They're more expensive to replicate, so there's expensive versions of these things. So number one, the fact that they're in these patterns indicates wealth. The second thing is, notice it's not blue, it's not green, it's not purple, it's coral, it's apple green, lavender, faint orange, Indian blue. These are very specific colors, and they're pastels. A lot of them are pastels. Pastels are very hard colors to sort of, especially in the 20s, to dye. The dyes are more expensive on things like that. So this is just really a representation of his wealth. And he takes them down and he throws them at Daisy, right? He throws them at her. He doesn't toss them, he doesn't place them by her side, he doesn't display them, he throws them at her. And I'm always thinking to myself that here's Gatsby literally throwing his wealth in Daisy's face. And I feel at some point you know, through everything that he's gone through, he had to have like a little bit of anger, like just a little bit of like, see what I did, look at what I was able to accomplish, like nobody thought I could. And like here's his moment, like maybe it's directed at the wrong person, it's directed towards Daisy, instead of like society, but she in a way kind of represents that like wealthy, classic, traditional society. But he, there's a little bit of violence. I always feel like there's a little bit of aggression behind his action here. So what is Daisy thinking about? She understands what he's doing here. Like, he isn't simply showing her his shirts. Like, she's not stupid. She knows what he's doing. So what is she thinking that makes her start crying? Talk to your desk mate for a moment. And then we get to introduce to this character Mr. Dan Cody. And then Gatsby does one of the more creepy things he's done throughout this novel. And he pulls out a scrapbook, and inside the scrapbook are pictures of Daisy. So I'm just going to warn you, if you go into somebody's house and they pull out a book and it's just pictures of you in that book, I would leave that house. But that's what he does. And how does he get these pictures? Daisy is wealthy enough that anything that she really does would be in the paper. So her wedding would have been in the paper. If she moved to town, it would have been in the paper. So she's like, Kim Kardashian in that way. Like, she can do anything and then she'll make the paper because she's not really famous for anything besides being wealthy. So, whatever she does, or like even Tom buys something, Tom goes somewhere, Tom donates something, it's going to make it into the paper. The birth of her child would have made it into the paper. So she's a little bit of like a local celebrity in that way because she's so wealthy. So he says, here's a lot of clippings about you. They stood side by side examining it. I always think that's funny. And then he gets a phone call. Says, yes, well, I can't talk now. I said, small town. He must know what a small town is. Well, he's no use to us if Detroit is his idea of a small town. And I always think this is great. In chapter 9, we're going to come back and talk about these phone calls. But just take note of it. Keep it in the back of your head that he gets this phone call. Outside Gatsby's window, it begins to rain again. So remember what one of our symbols was, right? Was the weather. And think about what was happening the last time it was raining, and then what was happening while it was sunshiny, and now it's beginning to rain again. So answer this question with your desk mate. How does that reflect Gatsby's ability to retain, to keep his American dream? And he looks across out the window, and he says, if it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. And that green light was Gatsby's dream, to be with Daisy. She's right there next to him. And I always wonder, and this passage specifically always puts things into context for me, because here he is. He literally has Daisy right next to him. We're going to read this passage, and she like reaches out and she touches him, right? She pulls his arm, puts it through his, and the only thing that he is focused on is that green light, is that dream. And I think that's telling where his headspace is, and it's a good reflection of why the rest of the novel turns out the way it does. It says, Daisy put her arm through his, abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. It had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. I think, again, here's Daisy touching him, and he can't get out of it. Gatsby has Daisy in front of him, and the only thing he can think about is his dream. And then how is has the symbol changed? Well, number one, it's not a symbol anymore, right? Because I think about, like, what happens after you achieve your dream, like after you get it, and it's like, okay, maybe we can't answer that question because we haven't worked, so diligently for something super significant. But if I can, like, miniaturize it for a moment, I'm going to give you 3 examples, and maybe you'll fall into one of these 3 categories. Number 1, if you're a video game player and you get a new video game and then you just play it nonstop, like hour after hour for like 7 days straight, or however long it takes you to beat the video game, and then you do it, you beat it, and you have this like moment of loss because you're like, whoa, what do I do now? Like, I've just been spending all of this time like working for this achievement, and now I've done it, and now what? Or if you're not a video game person, maybe you're a reader, and say you read a series and you just spent all this time reading, and you go one book after the other book, and you make it through the series, and you spent all of this time with this character and in this world, and then the series is done, and you're like, what do I do now? Well, how do I fill my time? Like, what's my thing? And then the final one, maybe you binge watch something. You're like, I have never seen The Walking Dead, and you binge watch it for 2 weeks straight, maybe 3 days if you're like crazy, and it's in the summer, and then you get done with it, and you're just like, oh my gosh, now what? There's this research out that says that people who achieve a dream that they've been searching for go through a depression afterwards, and it's because, what do you do now? And think about Gatsby, who's worked for 5 years to get to this moment. 5 years. Every single thing, every move he's made, every decision he's done is to get to this moment. Well, what happens now? Like, what's he gonna do with the rest of his life? That's something to think about. Whoa, now. What did I do? I don't know why I click on these things. Why do I make these dumb? How far? Okay. Oh, it's not so far off. Let's see. Scooch it forward here. Okay. I could probably put this video on pause and just found my spot and come back to it, but nope. I made you click through it with me. So Nick says, almost 5 years. There must have been moments even that afternoon when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. Not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. I mean, how can she live up to it? When Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. Is Daisy, I mean, can the Daisy that he's been dreaming about for 5 years, is that even the same Daisy that's in front of him? The one that he's like put up on a pedestal, the Daisy he remembers, is that Daisy even real? And Nick goes on and says, no amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man has stored up in his ghostly heart. So no matter how much passion is there, no matter how new Daisy is, right? It can't challenge what Gatsby has been pining for. Because that dream of Daisy isn't the real Daisy. That's going to be a rude sort of realization. Let's watch the clip from when Daisy goes over to the house.